Let me just get to the screen, the appropriate screen. So thanks everybody for coming. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whether you're joining us in person or virtually, welcome. My name is Jim Prendergast, and I'm your moderator for this morning or today's session, which is titled Combating Misinformation with Election Coalitions. If this isn't the session you thought it would be, we'd like you to stay anyway. So 2024 was a watershed year for elections. The UN called it a super year for elections. 60 plus countries held elections this year. I believe that's an all-time record. At a time when elections around the globe are increasingly vulnerable to the spread of misinformation, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Disinformation campaigns not only undermine electoral integrity, but they also erode trust in institutions, diminish civic participation, and in some cases polarize societies. But there's good news, and that's what we want to talk about. Today we're going to focus on the role of election coalitions, essentially partnerships between governments, civil society, private sector, fact checkers, encountering the rise of the tide of misinformation. These coalitions have emerged as a promising approach to build trust, promote credible information, and strengthen election resilience. But their effectiveness depends on a lot of factors, including strong coordination, shared resources, and clear strategies. I'm excited to be joined by a great group of experts on this topic who bring a diverse set of perspectives and extensive experience to the table, both in person and virtually. First off, let me introduce Alex Waldron, who's the Global Head of Human Rights for Google. She's seated here at the table with me. Wave to everybody on the line. Mivan Babakar, who's the News and Information Credibility Lead for MENA for Google. She is joining us from London. David Ajakobi, he's the Nigeria editor for Africa Check. He is also remote. And then finally, Daniel Bramanti, who's joining us from Brazil. He's an investigative journalist, and he wins the prize for the earliest time zone as a speaker. Before we begin, just a couple of things I'd like to point out. Our session is going to be, there are our speakers. Our session is going to start off with a couple of brief presentations from our speakers. I'll kick it off with a couple of questions, but we really want this to be interactive. We want this to be highly participatory. So for those of you online and those of you in person, we really encourage questions and conversation and discussion. With that, let's get started. Alex, could you sort of kick us off and help set the scene with explaining why you think election coalitions are important?
Sure, thanks. I think this global elections it's been a banner year for global elections, and Google has taken it seriously in all of these dozens of elections that have happened around the world this year. And so it's timely for us to be having this conversation, reflecting around the successes of the approaches that industry and our partners have had, and also looking forward to what do we need to do to strengthen those. So I'm really glad we're having this conversation today. I also think it's appropriate that we would be having this conversation at the IGF, where we are all focused on the multi-stakeholder model and the importance of that. Everything about what we're doing here at IGF is focused on the necessity of government and civil society and companies working together to ensure that we're all sort of realizing the benefits of what technology can deliver, and help, and that those relationships and that working together also should inform how we address problems that come before us. And so that's true across many types of issues, and in particular that's true across elections. And so I think my colleagues across the panel today are the best experts to demonstrate and talk through the ways that we've seen these successes. But, at Google, we have billions of people who come to our products every day. And in particular, in the election context, people are coming to find information and information about where to vote. And so we have an obligation and responsibility to make sure that we are doing the best to deliver information to those users, but also it is incumbent upon us to engage with the rest of the ecosystem to make sure that the things that are not really, or they're not necessarily in our power to change entirely, we need to be working with the rest of the ecosystem to ensure that there is integrity in the way that we're delivering information to all these billions of users around the world in the election context. So again, I'll stop there. I think Google's really excited to be having this conversation and hear the input from everybody in the room and online about how we do this work going forward.
Great. Thanks a lot, Alex. I'd now like to turn to Mivan, who's going to explain to us a project that she worked on, something she developed called the Elections Playbook. And Mivan, I'll be driving the slides for you, so just let me know when you want to advance.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Excellent. Okay, great. Let me just quickly. Okay. Hi everyone. I'm Mivan. I work at Google as well. I actually work in trust strategy now across knowledge and information. So that touches on search, touches on ads and other products that we have. But previously, I used to work in the Google News Initiative, and previous to Google, I actually worked in fact checking for a decade. So I used to work at Full Fact, the UK's independent fact-checking charity. And at my time at Full Fact and also at Google, I saw the power of election coalitions. And one of the things that became very clear to me is that election coalitions are actually quite a magical way of scaling the work of journalists and campaigners around the world, especially during elections. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the short history of election coalitions. Election coalitions, a research project that we've done specifically to capture some of the learnings from around the world. How you can form and organize an election coalition, some of the lessons learned from all of those interviews that we did as well. We've got 10 minutes. It'll be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to just jump in and ask them. So next slide, please. So 2024 was a very big election year, as Jim mentioned, and more than 2 billion people voted in over 60 different countries. But as we all know, mis and disinformation, unfortunately, is a big part of elections and has been around for as long as elections and probably longer. There are lots of ways to combat mis and disinformation in lots of different ways, but there is no silver bullet. There are very subtle and sometimes not so subtle nuances between countries that have quite a big difference in how you would combat misinformation. Things like public broadcasting, like community participation, press freedoms, all of these things actually necessitate a specific country level intervention. Over the past decade, journalists and fact checkers have come together to form these election coalitions. What they essentially are, just as a very top line, is when journalists, fact checkers, community organizations, sometimes lawyers, sometimes researchers, join forces and share resources or share the impact of the work that they do during a specific event like an election coalition. So it might be actually sharing the resources of their media monitoring, their actual research that they do. It might be sharing the learnings of the actual fact checks or the journalism. It might be sharing the impact or the scaling the actual outcomes of the work itself. One of the earliest examples was Election Land in 2016. This was a US coalition that was set up, and it was 1,100 journalists working together. It was a nationwide effort to cover voting rights and election administration in 2016. So there was a narrative going around that basically the election was rigged, and that narrative is one that still exists today, but key claims come up each time that the election was rigged. And historically, at least in 2016, the newsrooms were primarily focused on reporting the outcome of what happened on election day and the run-up to the political ins and outs. And voting issues were sort of relegated to secondary coverage. So a bunch of journalists and newsrooms came together and started Election Land to kind of combat that, especially because in the US, the election laws vary drastically from state to state and even country by country. So no national newsroom was at the time in a position to cover election administration through a wide lens. So all these newsrooms came together, and actually one of the things that they did was actually quite new at the time, was using social media to actually alert the local newsrooms and journalists that were taking part on specific claims that were coming up. around the election being rigged, so that they could actually localize specific narratives and specific claims to certain regions. And on top of that, they had 1,100 journalists to immediately and authoritatively rebut some of the pieces of misinformation that were coming out. It kind of showed at the time that news organizations, could work together, and that they can collaboratively serve as a watchdog for this crucial democratic moment that was taking place. And as it stands, in 2016, the Election Land Project won an online journalism award for its work. And since 2016, there have been at least 8 more coalitions, I think probably more, like 12 at this point. And they have operated not just for elections, sometimes across multiple elections. Like Comprova, for example, which we'll hear more about later, has run for multiple years now. And more recently, in 2024, although their logo isn't on this slide, we've had the Shakti Coalition in India, which is about 40 organizations coming together. And in the EU, the Election 24 Check, which was 45 organizations across Europe and working across 37 countries, who published 3,000 plus fact checks around the EU elections. I think it really shows that when newsrooms come together, or when fact checkers and community groups come together, the impact can scale quite drastically. There's something quite special in that model. Next slide, thanks. So Google has a long history of supporting these election coalitions, and we wanted to understand how to effectively build them and what they should look like to serve the needs of voters in the countries in the run-up to elections. But more importantly, there had already been so much learning from the past decade, and it's felt a bit like every single time everyone was starting from scratch. So we wanted to run a 6-month research project and talk to all of the election coalitions that had come before to understand exactly what the best ways of setting it up are, what are all the lessons learned over the past decade, and how can we effectively build them going forward. We ended up talking to 15 global experts, and the countries that we touched on was France, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Nigeria, and the Philippines, as well as the US. Yeah, one of the key things that I think has come out of the learnings is that there's really no one-size-fits-all approach to building a successful election coalition, because of the fact that each country is very unique in how it's set up. There are often different election laws, different voting systems. There are different news consumption habits, like radio, TV, social media. Like, these things are turned up or down. You'll need to change how you do your monitoring. There are also different types of misinformation taking place. Sometimes there are one-off instances of claims that maybe are more honest in the fact that it's misinterpreted something. Well, sometimes there's types of misinformation and disinformation that are direct foreign interference. And of course, these things would need different approaches. But having said that, there are some things that are shared across all the successful election coalitions. And by asking the right questions, we can start to build something much quicker and much more viable. So the things that have come up as sort of stages and needs in election coalitions is to identify the need, actually understand what is it that you're trying to do in the first instance. Although they're called election coalitions, and a lot of them are around mis and disinformation around election coalitions, that model has also been extended to pandemics, for example, so the COVID-19 pandemic and others as well, or epidemics in local regions, kind of share the same model. So figure out what it is that need that you're trying to meet specifically. It's become clear that we need to identify the lead as well. So a specific organization often takes charge of the larger coalition, not necessarily as the spokesperson, but as the organizing lead for any kind of coalition to take place. And I think it's really important that this is one of the things that came out of the interviews. It's really important that that organization that takes the lead in that country context is seen as neutrally as possible, or as seen as balanced as possible. Because a really key point of the election coalitions is that you want a broad spectrum of actors and journalists that meet the needs of voters. And depending on how polarized that ecosystem is, you might want to use it as a means of building trust in institutions or building trust in journalism or fact checking or whatever it is that's happening in those countries. So having that as a key aim really, really helps. And identifying a lead that is as neutral as possible helps build that bridge. Determining the membership, whether it's formal or informal, whether actually you're focusing on subject experts or technology partners, these are all very important steps and things to formalize before the actual coalition comes together. And then I think the next two are very important, actually. Implementing capacity building programs is especially important for an election coalition when there are multiple media organizations working together, because historically those media organizations work against one another. They're competitors. And I think that what they're doing here is actually quite unique. They're coming together, sharing resources, they're sharing sometimes outputs, and they're working in a much more collaborative way. So trust building is an incredibly important part of these election coalitions. And trust isn't something that is earned overnight. It is earned through example, it's earned through case studies, it's earned through the experience of working with one another. And the more times that you can bring people in the election coalition together in person, the better it will be for that. And then on top of that, making sure that people kind of have the same skills and resources available to them. Developing clear coalition policies is key. There are actually two models for election coalitions that I have seen so far. We call them the collaborative approach and the independent approach. In the collaborative approach, the organizations actually share resources to do the media monitoring together, they check together, they edit together. It actually becomes one mega newsroom. And actually, they publish the final outputs of the pieces across their multiple media organizations as well. That's the collaborative approach. In the independent approach, and we see this more sometimes when people don't have the trust necessarily to jump in together yet. In the independent approach, there's no commitment to share the output. So often people will maybe share the media monitoring side of things, but then do the check or the article through their own independent editorial processes. And then that's kind of shared across newsrooms or across a platform. And organizations can choose whether to share it or not. So there's no commitment to share it. But still, there's a lot of value there in understanding what are the shared narratives happening in that country and actually what are the gaps that still need to be filled that haven't been filled across the ecosystem. And then other things like figuring out the branding of the coalition, etc., the code of ethics and standards and correction policies is incredibly important when many newsrooms come together. Next slide, please. So some of the key things that came out were about preparation, starting early and planning for scale is incredibly important. With an election coalition, you can't start too early. I think that there's a lot of prep to do for them, and the sooner you build trust, the better. Diversity and collaboration is a really key part. We've already mentioned that scale and that width of partners is very important. But often you have a layer of journalists, and then that intersects with the community as well. And so in some places, you actually get media and civil society organizations taking part as well. And that's an opportunity to go even broader and more diverse in trying to get the stories out there. And finally, context. So actually understanding how the context in your own country might be changing. In some cases, for example, there might be a growth in AI misinformation, and understanding, do you have tools across your AI, across your election coalition to actually be able to combat that? Next, please. I'm going to just quickly touch on two case studies, and one of those was Crosscheck in France in 2017. It brought together over 30 organizations, and it was led by Agence France Presse, AFP, who took on the editorial leadership of it. They had 37 partners, and across the videos that they all shared, they had 1.2 million video views in total. and they published hundreds of articles between them. Gregoire Lemarchand, the chief editor of the digital verification program at AFP, said, "This is for us one of the biggest wins in AFP history. Crosscheck will always be special personally. Sometimes I meet colleagues who took part in this project and they say, 'Do you remember Crosscheck? That was so great.'" And I think that's a really key part, is that trust that it builds across journalists is really important, and it lives beyond the election coalition too. Next slide, please. Then we have Facts First PH, which is one of my favorites. Sorry, everyone else. But they had 131 partners working together, and they published 1,400 fact checks. Gemma Mendoza, the head of research and strategy at Rappler, said, "The thing with these is that these are experiments. I wouldn't say Facts First PH was perfect. At the time we were experimenting, and the reason why you wanted to experiment was because there was a huge challenge." And it's true, there is a huge challenge. And even when we look at these numbers, 131 partners and 1,400 fact checks, it might not feel like it's big enough to meet the scale. But I think one of the important things we need to remember is that with misinformation, there are often just a handful of narratives that are the most well-known and well-seen narratives and that cause the most harm. And actually, if we focus efforts on those narratives and those pieces that are being seen the most or the most harmful, you can actually go quite a long way to kind of interrupting the flow of misinformation in each country. Next slide, please. I think one of the things that the Rappler team did very, very well in the Philippines with Facts First PH is that they introduced something called the mesh. They had all of these authoritative information sources in blue. So these were journalists, expert institutions, fact checkers. These were actually producing the research. And then in red, the mesh, they actually had over 100 orgs that were separate to the information providers. And these were influencers, NGOs, communities, trusted people in their communities. And they would then go out and share the outputs of the election coalition more broadly. And I thought that was a really amazing model, the kind of impact that that had in the Philippines in terms of building trust and showing people that there was an answer to misinformation was actually very, very powerful. And then just more broadly on top of that, there was also research. So taking all the learnings from that, and then finally accountability and change. There are some actors around the world that take the outputs of the authoritative information that's being found or being introduced into the world to combat harms, and then actually using it as evidence to hold people accountable, for example, in the International Criminal Court sometimes, or in legal cases. And I think that that's also a really important part of the misinformation challenge. It's not just about combating misinformation. It's also about looking for that systemic change that might improve the system overall. I'm going to leave it there. I appreciate I've been talking for a long time, but I'm really pleased to share this with you all today. If you want to learn more about all of the case studies and go into depth in any of this stuff, then there's this Election Coalitions playbook that we've published alongside Anchor Change. And actually there's a podcast as well with Claire Wardle and Daniel, who's here today, that took place as well, where you can get a summary of everything. So please download it, enjoy it, use it. And if you ever make an election coalition, get in touch. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Mivan. I think I know the answer to this question before I ask it, but I've noticed, at least in the room, some people are taking camera shots of the slides. Are you willing to share them with anybody who would like them? Yeah, perfect. That's what I figured. Okay, great. So we've already had a couple of examples, case studies of country election coalitions. I'm going to now ask David to share his experience with election coalitions in Africa. Good morning, David. Are you there?
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Can you see me?
We can, and we can hear and see you. Looking great.
Greetings from Lagos, Nigeria. So I think Mevan has already sort of set the tone to the conversation. I think I wanted to add a few things. I think largely for us at Africa Check, we are the continent's leading first independent fact-checking organization. And what we've sort of done with the election coalition work is to also help other countries around the elections to set up, the coalitions. It can be it sounds very, very pretty when everyone was saying it, but it can be very problematic, particularly in a continent like Africa where, historically, media ownerships are often, the media is often owned by either politically exposed people or person or outright politicians, or by government. So, but what we've been able to do essentially is to say, look, we would bring everybody on the table and we'll have a common interest to say we want elections to our elections to hold. We want integrity in our elections. We do not want disinformation to be the third candidate or the fourth candidate in Africa elections. And so far so good, we've actually established some successes. And I'll give you an example. I just got back from Ghana, where we're able to sort of help foster an election coalition group comprising of Dubawa, Ghana Fact, Fact Space, and other partners. And what we essentially saw was that traditionally people did things in their own different, corners, right? But together, it's like coming together. They were able to sort of form a formidable front, and we saw how that panned out in the last elections in Ghana that brought about the election of John Mahama as the new president of the country, and so much so in the sense that the collaboration also helped with, it was inclusive. The inclusive nature of the collaboration, because, for example, in Ghana, there were situation rooms in Accra, in the south. There were disinformation monitoring situation rooms in Tamale, which was in the north. So what that did was that we were able to also map out not just the actors, but also the patterns we're seeing from region to region. And I can say the same thing about the Senegal elections that brought about Boussarou Faye, where we had an election coalition. We had the same thing even in South Africa. And if we follow what happened in South African elections, where for the first time they had a government of national unity, because and we saw how this information played out in all of that. And I'll give you my own context in Nigeria, where we had elections in 2023, which is one of the biggest elections in Africa, where we had more than 50 million voters in that election. Having a situation room, having an election coalition was a very great way, not just about fact checking alone or debunking, but also helps with debunking, because we already had experience with the 2019 elections when we did coalitions to say we would know that this kind of election disinformation would spread. On election day, we would have things like, oh, one candidate has stepped up for another candidate, so we can actually debunk that. But also, just like what Megan said, that we were able to use the coalitions to introduce AI tools, new tools, capacity building. So, for example, the tool developed by Full Fact in collaboration with Africa Check and Chekiado was provided for free to the coalition members in Ghana, Nigeria, and practically all the countries that had election coalitions in Africa. And for us, that is a very, very big step, because naturally those individual organizations might not be able to access that, but with the coalitions, we were able to sort of give them for free, onboard them for free, in collaboration with Full Fact, Kate Wilkinson in Full Fact. So for us, it wasn't just about the election; it was the opportunity to collaborate at a larger scale. And I'll give an example. For my context in Africa, radio plays a very important role. So you cannot talk about election coalitions without talking about the impact of radio. So at the level that, if you look at the structure that Mevan presented, where you have the collaborative nature, what we did was that apart from the fact checkers, the CSOs, and the media literacy we're doing, we also partnered with radio stations across the continent when we're doing election work. What I did was that our content was able to reach a lot of more people, and also people who were in news deserts or underserved communities, or people who were what we'd call media inclusion. So for us, that was very, very important, and we think that moving on with elections that are coming around in 2025, it's an opportunity to actually connect to do more. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much. Turn your camera back on for a second, because I want everybody to note that David gets bonus points for color coordinating his outfit with the theme color of the IGF. I also want to thank you for, calling out the importance of radio. I think so many people are focused on the next technology and the future of technology and where these problems are happening that sometimes, including myself, we forget about what's already there, or how different environments consume news. So your comments about radio are certainly hitting home with me, and I'm sure with others. So Daniel, you've got some experience with this in Brazil, and I believe we got you up in the middle of the night to share those with us. So why don't you tell us how it went for you and some lessons learned there?
Well, thanks for having me. I am the editor of Estadão Verifica, the fact-checking unit of O Estado de São Paulo newspaper, and also a member of the advisory board of IFCN, the International Fact-Checking Network. I'm going to talk about the largest and most successful and most durable collaborative project involving journalism in the history of the Brazilian press, which of course is the Comprova project. The origin. At the beginning of 2018, the Brazilian Association, the Brazilian Investigative Journalism Association, ABRAGE, was invited to organize and coordinate a coalition of 24 media outlets to combat misinformation and disinformation in that year's presidential elections. I was then president of ABRAGE. And the invitation came from the researcher Claire Wardle, then head of First Draft and author of the famous report Information Disorder from 2017. Google was one of the sponsors of the project. I have to say that at first, not all media outlets showed enthusiasm for the project. Of course, the news market is very competitive in Brazil, and there was no culture of collaboration between different companies here. But gradually, resistance was broken down, mainly because there was great concern about the impact of disinformation campaigns during the presidential race. Everyone knew that the challenge of containing disinformation was too great to be faced in isolation. And all decisions related to the project were made through consensus building without imposing directions or rules. Even the name of the project was chosen by the participants themselves. In Portuguese, comprova means to verify or to check, and also sounds like the words comprova, which means with proof. So there is a wordplay here. An important decision we made was to limit our verification work to content generated by social media users. We didn't check the candidate's speeches or statements. As one of the candidates lied a lot more than the others, it was probable that he would be the most contradicted. And so many media outlets were concerned about the possibility of conveying the idea that they were against this candidate, or that they wanted to benefit their opponents. The vast majority of the media outlets invited to take part in Comprova did not have fact-checking units in their newsrooms. So dozens of journalists had to be trained using the methodology provided by First Draft. These professionals were from TV stations, radio stations, newspapers, magazines, and digital native media. Organizations of different sizes that reached different audiences in different parts of Brazil. In essence, Comprova put journalists from different companies to work together to debunk misleading content, and the final result was only published after a cross-checking process, meaning that at least 3 media outlets not involved in the original fact-checking had to give their approval to the work done by other colleagues. In addition to working together, another important aspect was the amplifying power of the media outlets involved. The fact checks were almost always published by all 24 participants in the project. So after a first face-to-face meeting in May 2018, Comprova was officially launched in June and during the Congress of Abrage, and in August we started publishing our first fact checks. The election campaign, which ended in October, confirmed our worst fears. There was a huge circulation of misleading content, and this content generated enormous engagement with a public that wasn't prepared to deal with the problem. We had a lot of work, but also a lot of enthusiasm. All the work was done remotely. I'm talking about 2 years before the pandemic here. And to coordinate our activities, we used a WhatsApp group. The amount of messages exchanged in this group was immense. In 6 months, around 50 journalists exchanged more than 18,000 messages in the group. And I did a word count on these messages and found that more than 315,000 words were written. For comparison, that's more text than any book of the Harry Potter saga. So we learned some lessons. Number one, a shared purpose motivates journalists much more than competition. Number two, horizontal collaboration works best if there is central coordination also. Number three, the role of the central coordinator, the project editor, is not to give orders like a boss, but to act as a diplomat who seeks to build consensus and break down resistance when needed. And we learned fundamentally that fact-checking is hard, very hard. Sometimes it took us days to get the information we needed to disprove a piece of content that clearly had been created in minutes. We managed to publish around 12 fact checks per week, or 147 in total. Organizers and participants were very satisfied with the experience, and as a result, Comprova did not end in 2018 as originally planned. The consortium remains active to this day with the mission of fact-checking rumors related to public policies, health, climate change, and other topics. We also worked together during the pandemics, fact-checking false rumors about vaccines and the virus, and the electoral campaigns of 2020, 22, and 24. The number of participants grew to more than 40. Our work in 2022 was especially important because in that year, there was a wave of attacks on the integrity of the Brazilian electoral process. There was a lot of content citing false vulnerabilities in the electronic voting machines and suggesting that there was fraud to benefit one of the candidates. We didn't know at the time, but many of these rumors were created and spread by state actors, by intelligence agents from the Brazilian government, with the aim of destabilizing our democracy. Recent investigations by the Brazilian Federal Police have revealed that we almost suffered a coup d'etat that year, and that the disinformation campaigns were part of the plan. We still have democracy in Brazil, and I don't want to exaggerate our role, but I think I can say without fear of being wrong that journalism contributes to these results. Thank you very much.
Great, Daniel. Thank you. Unlike many of the sessions you may have been at the IGF to date, we have this room both physically and Zoom room till 11 a.m. So that's 45 minutes that we have set aside for comments, questions, and discussion. As I told you at the outset, we wanted this to be as interactive and engaging as possible. So I actually see we have a question already online, but while I get my act together on that, I'm going to throw one out to the group to sort of let folks in the room think about it. But one of the things that I was struck by was, Daniel, you talked about this, is pivoting from an election to other things like the pandemic, where you're doing fact checking. I guess for everybody, how do you keep the momentum going? I'm biased. I just came out of a national and congressional election in the U.S. where we were bombarded nonstop with election ads and all sorts of stuff. And frankly, we're tired. I can't imagine how journalists feel coming off of a cycle like that. How do you keep the momentum going, both from elections and from other issues? Either state or local state or local, or other events like a pandemic. So, whoever wants to take that first, go ahead.
I can go first. In the Comprova case, the media outlets that participate in the project are the same, but not the journalists. We rotate the team so that more people can get together and learn from the others. So basically, we have a fresh team working together every year, so that this is not a problem to us.
Mevan or David, any comments on that one? Go ahead, Mevan.
Sure. I think it's really important in my experiences of being in election coalitions myself before Google, and being a journalist for a long time, it's really important to look after yourself in those situations and to look after the team. And it's important to also step away when it becomes too much. I think that actually the emotional burden that a lot of people take on in these situations is quite high, especially, when we talk about elections. That's one experience, but a lot of people are fact checking during conflict in war zones, or like doing work that actually, where you end up seeing things that are quite harmful yourself. And I think the well-being of the team and the people is actually the thing that must be preserved and looked after beyond anything else. I wanted to recommend a handbook that was written called it's about vicarious trauma and how to look after people in a newsroom specifically. And I'm going to put a link to it in the chat, but it has really great recommendations for how to look after journalists, newsrooms, and campaigners so that actually they don't experience vicarious trauma through the work that they do. I think it's a really great resource for answering that question.
Great, thank you. David, I saw you flash your camera on. You want to weigh in?
Yeah, so for us, we had a very interesting case in 2019. So in 2019, we had an election coalition, and it was sort of midwifed by a foreign organization. And because the language or the reason, the thinking behind it was not so clear to some media partners, what happened was that, you were expecting to be paid. And I could tell you that when they got paid and when the money dried up, I mean, people left the conversation. Only Africa Check, Dubawa, and Fact Check Hub, 3 IFCM members, stuck to that goal. And but what we did with 2023 elections in Nigeria was that we said, look, we wanted people who understood the role of media in a democracy like Nigeria. For example, my country has had decades of military rule, so having elections done properly and the outcome of the election done, in a country like this is very important. And, the media has a role to play in that. And I'll also give you the example of the fact that by doing so, we had partners who were committed to that. And in the election coalition in Nigeria in 2023, there was no single external funding. In fact, there was no single funding. What we did was to collapse our individual election work into the coalition work. So what I did was that we were all equal stakeholders, right? And also, just to speak to that point, Nigeria has off-season elections. So we've had state elections in about 4 or 5 states since 2023. And we've come together again to set up the coalition room. Africa Check set up the one in Lagos. Dubawa or Fact Check set up the one in Abuja, for example. But we're seeing across the continent that there's a lot of funding and sponsorship and support coming from Google News Initiative and other funders for the coalitions, But we think that if we have journalists and fact checkers and media partners who have a common sense of understanding the role of the media in democracies, it wouldn't be a problem. It's not been a problem so far in Africa and some of the election coalitions that we have coordinated. So, I think that's one of the key successes we've had.
Thanks a lot, David. So we do have an online question, which I'll read out. It is from Hazel Bitanya. I hope I got that right. Any experience or thoughts in involving children or young people who are non-voters but would like to contribute to the discourse, either as fact checkers or part of disinformation campaigns or as the target audience of these campaigns? Who would like to take that?
I can jump in really quickly with that. I haven't seen any young people being included in an election coalition specifically, but that, and maybe David and Daniel will know more than I do on this, but I do know that there have been like media literacy efforts that include young people for sure. And one that comes to mind is the Teen Fact Checking Network that MediaWise run. That's run out of Pointer in the US, but they would actually go and work with teenagers and actually teach them what does it look like to even fact check? What is a fact check? How can you go out and check something that you see on social media? And a while ago now, Chequeado in Argentina used to run a really big schools network as well of fact checking and fact checkers. And they had a series of videos that actually had nothing to do with politics. It was a lot about, you have seen a post on the internet and it's about your friend, and someone is pretending that your friend has done something that they haven't. And actually, they set it up in a way that it was almost like a series of you were a detective trying to figure out what had happened, and you could use a reverse image search, and you could run a couple of the searches that would actually help you get contextual information. And it really helped the young people who took part not just learn those skills, but also to ask the right questions. And I think that's a really important part of it. It's not necessarily to just learn fact checking through the lens of politics. It's actually just being critical in your day-to-day when you see something. And I think that question part of it is the most important. I'll link to those two projects as well in the chat so you can see more.
Thanks. David, did you want to add something?
Yes, I wanted to add quickly that specifically for election coalition work, we involved the Nigerian Union of Campus Journalists. These are actually students who are campus journalists, who are based on campuses, basically pretty much like press clubs. We invited them to the situation rooms when we were doing the elections, which would typically last for like a week or two, to see how we were operating every day and how the fact-checking process works in newsrooms and also in that context. Then two was the fact that we also had student volunteers, students who would come out to say, oh, can we join you guys? So that was very important. But beyond the coalition work that we did, for example, in Africa Check, we also we were trying to do what we call the Finnish model, where we were trying to get across to school learners who were below a voting age. So we had a project sponsored by the UN agency, where we went to schools to actually teach them basic, how to fact checking, with very simple exercises. And we actually incorporated games, because we feel that young people, it's easier to catch their attention with games and things like that. And we're seeing that, the feedback has been very fantastic, particularly when it comes to, because these school learners will turn 18 and will be the next batch of voters in 2027. And we thought that by raising the critical thinking skills now will help them access or, navigate the murky waters of the election with disinformation when the next wave of elections are coming up in Africa. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We've got a couple of questions in the room, so I'm going to pass this microphone to the woman to my. Hopefully, it's still working.
Yeah, hi, my name is Lena Slackmulder. I'm with Search for Common Ground and the Council on Tech and Social Cohesion. I just want to congratulate all of you because this is exemplary work. It also aligns with what Google has signed on to, which is the voluntary election integrity guidelines for tech companies that IFES worked with you and many other industry partners, and where there's hopefully a momentum to try and put these kinds of things in practice. So just want to really acknowledge that. It's hard work, it's good work. But I have 4 questions that I want to raise, and I'm very curious to hear what you think. The first is that there is a lot of evidence about Google's ad policy monetizing mis and disinformation. And so while the fact-checking work is critical, you actually have an upstream driver of misinformation that doesn't seem to be discussed in these kinds of conversations. Secondly, we see how generative AI is very quickly taking over search. And that includes your own AI summaries and plus all of the competition between all of the AI companies, which could seriously disrupt the things that Google has done so well in terms of upranking higher quality information over years. It's been a big point of credibility, but this risks to disintegrate. Number 3 is that these countries and the examples of this, and Indonesia and other places, is excellent, but we had 80 elections or 60 to 80 elections. And, we work in places that are struggling, that are conflict affected. And these kinds of coalitions don't happen in places like Chad. They don't happen in other places where between civil society and government is so incredibly deep that it's difficult. So the question is, how does Google act when in fact there isn't a coalition? Do you try and take the initiative? And the last question is similar in the sense that I believe Google was part of the pre-bunking effort in Europe to try to tackle misinformation through pre-bunking. And if I'm not mistaken, it was an initiative that you took, but you haven't taken that initiative in all the other places, notably in the global south, where we have similar issues. And sometimes the consequences of misinformation in these conflict-affected societies is deadly.
Thank you very much. There's a lot to digest there. Mivan, do you want to take the first shot at some of it, what you can? I guess one of the things I would ask is, and it was one of the questions I actually had for David because he used the term first, pre-bunking. Up until this week, I'd never heard that word before. So explain what that is, part of your answer. Sure.
Let me first say I think those are all very important questions, and I'm grateful that they've have a forum to be asked. Pre-bunking is when there is a narrative that is trending in a country, or there's like a series of claims that add up to a narrative that might be seen at the sharp end of a news outlet, etc. And instead of dealing with it after it's been published and after it's actually trending and viral, pre-bunking deals with it beforehand. So, for example, in the UK, I know that every single election, based on my year's fact-checking, there's going to be a claim that comes up around the election, around day 1 of voting, or the day before voting, that will say, if you use a pencil to actually mark your X on your piece of paper, then your vote is invalid. And that's a claim that comes up every single year. It's not true, but it comes up and it's used to disenfranchise people sometimes. Another claim that comes up is something that will say, if you're voting for this party, you vote on this day. If you're voting for this other party, you vote on this day. And it might feel innocuous, but these are things that we know are going to come up. And sometimes they can cause harm. And they might disenfranchise specific populations. So instead of dealing with that that piece of misinformation after it's actually going viral, a pre-bunk will actually warn people that this is going to happen maybe weeks and months in advance. You know, it will say one of the kind of tactics that we've seen is these kinds of claims being used to disenfranchise people, or it will teach people about straw man arguments or the kind of tactics and manipulations that take place so that people are sort of inoculated or vaccinated against the misinformation when they see it. So that's a pre-bunk. I think a really important part of a pre-bunk is that it's not Google trying to push this out there. It's actually the community organizations that have the relationships. And I think this kind of goes to some of the questions. In a lot of these cases, I think it's really important, and this is why we do the work on election coalitions, that it's not just one organization pushing out a narrative. It's actually communities identifying misinformation that affects them, and then those same communities being empowered to combat that misinformation themselves. Because it's one thing for somebody in that community to fix it, it's another thing for an external party to come in and say, this is how it should be. And we both know which one's going to engender more trust. And I think that that's a really important part of this puzzle. In the case of pre-bunking, it's still a relatively new effort, and it's one that's led by Jigsaw. And actually, just last week, or at the beginning of December, they graduated pre-bunking into the real world, and actually handed it over to a series of community organizations. And the idea is that those community organizations will be the ones that kind of further it and grow it. And that includes people from across the globe. So it shouldn't be just a EU-centric effort. It should be something that exists around the world. But I think it is resource intensive and it requires infrastructure. And I think that part of this election coalition's work is building that infrastructure for things like pre-bunking to actually jump off of. And because having that layer of community organizations and journalists working together is the scaffolding that we need for things like pre-bunking to actually take effect. Your other questions were about how does Google act when there isn't an election coalition, or where there isn't that kind of infrastructure already in place, like you mentioned, Chad, for example. I think that's a really important question. And I also think that there's an element of that that's supporting understanding what are the prerequisites for an election coalition. And in some cases, yes, it does require community organizations to already exist. It requires services. It requires a certain amount of media organizations to be present. And I think in the cases when those things aren't present, we have societal conversations, we have societal challenges that we need to tackle. And I think that's not something that Google should do in isolation. It's something that we all need to talk about together. And actually, Google plays a part in it, but so does figuring out actually how to create those structures in a completely different environment. And then finally on Gen AI and ads. On Gen AI, I think it's a really important question. And actually a lot of my work at Google these days is about building tools to support fact checkers working with Gen AI. I think it's important to say that a lot of the fact checkers are really excited about using Gen AI and AI tools. And I think that that's sometimes missed as a part of this conversation. The scale of the misinformation that already exists is quite high. And I think we're all aware that manual efforts alone are not enough to fix it. So there's an opportunity there to use AI to actually help the battle. And that's not to replace anybody, but actually to just support the efforts. And David already mentioned the full fact AI tools that are used by over 50 organizations around the world now. And that helps fact checkers actually spot repeat instances of misinformation, to actually do some primary checking. And actually, it doesn't take the fact checker or journalist out of the equation, but it supercharges them to do more and more at scale. And I think that's really important. And I think finally on Gen AI, the EU election coalition that I mentioned, the Election 24 check, we actually funded them to do some research with the 3,000 fact checks that they did this time around to actually like tag the ones that came out with Gen AI. And actually, it was surprisingly low, the number of instances of Gen AI that caused harm in an election cycle. I'm not saying that it won't cause harm. Obviously, it has the potential to. That's an obvious thing. But I also think that it's interesting to consider that at this moment in time, it's not doing that. So how can we actually find instances of where pre-bunking might actually help with Gen AI? So in Taiwan, for example, one of the ministers would put out deep fakes of themselves ahead of an election coalition to inoculate the population against it. And I think that's a really interesting case study. But having said that, the harms of Gen AI is still quite high, and there's a lot of efforts at the moment across Google to combat potential harm from AI election information, especially. So there's something called Synth ID. This is watermarking. So where we actually add like a little signature into any image that's generated by Google, and we would be able to flag if it's a generated AI image or not in any of our tools. We're also part of something called the C2PA coalition. It actually is an industry standard for assessing where information has come from and the provenance of information. And those are being added into our tools right now. So if you see an image, you'd be able to say this is where it came from. And beyond provenance, we're actually also working on a series of tools that are about giving people more context. So when you actually see a piece of misinformation and you see that it's AI generated, you can also go to things like about this image or about this page on search, which tells you how old is this image, where has it come from, who first published it, are there any fact checks about it? And so encouraging people to do lateral reading around it is a really important part of this. So that's the kind of user intervention side of it. And then finally, there are a whole host of policies that remove hundreds and thousands of ads, like thousands and thousands of ads every single day. And whether or not those thresholds are exactly in the right places, that's a conversation that's constantly being had and changes in each country and changes with different laws and regulations. But I think it's an important challenge. But I think that the thing that I'd like to leave you all here with is this isn't a thing where it's just one answer. It's different in every single country. It's different in every single threshold. The context keeps changing. The tools keep changing. And actually, it's something where the seesaw of it is hopefully going in the right direction, but we do keep seesawing, if that makes sense. I've spoken a lot, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah, you're entitled to another sip of tea there. So great exchange. And Lena's asked. Lena knows the routine because she's asked questions before. So when you do ask a question, which we have a couple in the room, just please identify yourself and your affiliation. So I'll turn it over to Milton.
Thanks, Jim. I'm Milton Mueller. I'm at the Internet Governance Project at Georgia Tech. I want to begin by challenging the term misinformation. I'm, in a sort of a computer science algorithmically driven university, and the term tends to encourage the idea that misinformation is something that has a signature that you can just recognize and somehow kick out of the bit stream. And I think the Google speaker was very perceptive in pointing out that it's narratives, it's interpretations. And I don't know why we don't just say false or misleading information, because that makes it clear that when you interfere in these discourses, you are essentially setting yourself as an arbiter of truth. Now, I love this idea of coalitions of journalists who are coalescing to do fact-checking, because that is fully in line with the liberal democratic idea of the role of the press in a free society, right? You are not forcing anybody to do anything. You are just simply responding to bad speech with correct speech or good speech. But there's an elephant in the room here that I hope to see addressed and that I want to ask you about. And I'm sure the Google people are very aware of this. There's a high degree of concentration of communication and discourse around platforms. And as a result of that, contestation over what those platforms suppress and what they promote the stakes are raised very high. And in particular, when governments get involved in trying to influence those decisions, you get problems. You also get problems with perceptions of bias from the platforms, which are well known as, being situated in liberal California and Silicon Valley, as not being exactly in red state territory. And perhaps the Hunter Biden laptop story is a perfect example of where, you think you're suppressing misinformation, but you're actually responding to maybe political pressure from people who think that a certain amount of information that might actually be true is going to harm the chances of their favored candidate in the election. So I'm concerned about how you set the threshold for where you actually intervene in these false narratives or misleading narratives. I don't want to use the word misinformation. And I'm particularly concerned about how you handle the role of government. We have a series of court cases, again, Murphy versus Missouri. We have the Supreme Court case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. We have state legislation in Florida, which is trying to regulate the way you make these decisions and impose common carrier obligations. So this issue is really a lot more. I mean, it's great to have these journalistic coalitions, but legally and economically, this issue is a lot more wrought than you've made it out to be here. And I'd like to know how you handle those situations, particularly, again, when the government is an interested actor in the outcome of an election, obviously, right? So what happens when you get pressure from governments to suppress information that may be damaging to them or that may be an extension of their policy?
I just didn't know if you wanted to pass the mic to somebody else and take more than one at a time. Okay.
Sorry, yeah. We'll take a couple of questions from the room and then we can sort of bounce them around.
I think there's sound now. That's a good start. So good morning, everybody. My name is Claes de Vries. I'm from the University of Amsterdam and also on the executive board of the European Digital Media Observatory. I have 3 quick questions. I really appreciate the eye for sort of the local context in which these coalitions are built, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit more as to how you choose partners who are in or outside of these coalitions, since there are so many new and relatively unknown actors when building these coalitions in different election contexts. So the sort of how to build and which partners are in or outside of the scope. The second question would be, what in your Google playbook are the best advices that you give the coalitions in dealing with critiques that they might get that they're trying either to stifle free speech or to intervene in the elections, which is a common critique that is coming from different vantage point in different kinds of elections. And then the third question would be, how is Google trying to be proactive in actually building a coalition that would also have multiple big tech platforms at the table, so that you would see a coalition that is rather driven maybe by an industry interest, the more so maybe than 1 or 2 individual companies. So those would be my 3 questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. So Mivan, I hope you've refreshed your palette, because I think a lot of them are directed at you, but not all of them. So do you want to start us off, and then we'll maybe work Daniel and David into the conversation?
Sure. I'm actually out of tea, unfortunately. I feel like I need a top up. But I will say, I just want to make it really clear, based on that last question, that these election coalitions are not Google-run election coalitions. These are communities of journalists and fact checkers and social organizations that have come together, created the coalition, and then gone for funding. And Google just happens to be one of the people that have funded it. So I think that's a really important part of this. These are like interested, important people in their own communities, in their own countries, coming together to build something that actually serves the voters of those countries. And the only thing really that Google has done is supported them, either with resource or with funding, and done this research project to kind of collect some of the learnings from them, so that if another group of organizations comes to us with an election coalition, we can say, hey, here are the lessons of the other coalitions that have come before you, and you can learn from them. And so I really want to just make that very clear. So we don't choose who are the partners that are in the election coalition. It's not us picking and choosing. It's actually the organizations themselves coming up with their own ecosystem, their own collaboration, their own policies, their own membership models, their own capacity building programs. And I think that's a really important part there. You had a question about how do they really stop the challenges of being said to censor and free speech. And I'm going to take off my Google hat for 1 second and put on my fact checker hat. And when I used to work at Full Fact, and we used to get Full Fact, the UK's fact checking charity, we used to get a lot of, fact checks are censoring speech kind of conversations. And our response at the time, and still is, used to be, well, fact checking is the free speech response to misinformation. We're not actually taking anything down as fact checkers. We're adding more context. We're giving you more information so that you can make up your own mind. And I think that's how we used to deal with it as fact checkers. But Daniel and David can probably give you a much better answer for where things are these days.
Milton, I'll ask. We'll get a response from Daniel and David first, then we'll cycle back to you.
I think that Mivan's response is perfect. I really contest this idea that fact checking is censorship. You have to have content moderation in platforms. You have content moderation regarding violence, regarding pornography, regarding other things, and also you have to have content moderation regarding the flow of bad information that contributes to polluting our media ecosystem, our information ecosystem. So the other thing, there were so many questions. I just want to mention briefly that how we decided who enters the coalition and in the beginning and after. So in Comprova, at the beginning, our goal was to reach reach a large percentage of the Brazilian public. So we invited to the table all the big players in the media here, and also we tried to balance different media organizations according to their editorial orientation, more to the left, more to the right, and also contemplating local players. So it was a very diverse group, in my opinion. And since we decided to keep Comprova going, all the new participants are they ask to enter the coalition, and we decide collaboratively, and everybody has a veto power if we give the okay or not to that applicant. And to this day, in my to my knowledge, we never close the door to anybody.
So coming back to you, Mivan, to Milton's question about thresholds and how do you determine when you take action and when you don't? Did I incorporate one of them? Okay.
I can jump in just quickly on
Sure,
the
Alex.
one about sort of the challenges of how we engage with governments and the government pressure and how that does or does not impact us. And then I'll kick it over to you, Mivan, to talk more about the definition of misinformation and the challenges around that. Although I will say on that piece, you know, having worked on this from the beginning when we were like when fake news was the term, and then we all decided fake news was not the right term, and there are still many conversations happening all over where, you know, mal information. I think, you know, for us at a company, we sort of have to just land on something and figure out how to operationalize it while we're managing these harms. And we also will continue to be part of conversations around what's the appropriate lexicon for how we're describing what are just sort of abuse or exploitation of the services that we're providing. But when it comes to sort of the challenges of governments, on the one hand, obviously, we are deeply committed to partnering with governments across a lot of the work that we do, and increasingly so, that's the case. But also, you know, I'm agreeing with you that also it's the case that governments and parties they're interested parties in the outcomes of elections, and so we have to be mindful of the role that we have in engaging neutrally. And so really that gets back to the importance of us having clear and robust policies in place to make sure that we are consistently addressing any of these issues as they come to us. So on the one hand, that's about having clear policies that are the product policies. How do we define election misinformation or misrepresentation or the variety of other things that might come up? How do we ensure that that's clear? And then we really do have to enforce that consistently across all of our policies in every country. And then also being clear about when it's, for legal reasons, we might need to remove something under a national law. And so it's perfectly legitimate for any government to say this content violates our local law and here's an order and you need to remove it. In that case, we would evaluate it under our standards. And then if we, under our analysis, it's consistent with the local law and we've received the appropriate process from the proper authority, we may remove that, and then that would be something that we put in our transparency report and make clear to everyone that we have complied with a law under the national, which is a national requirement. So I think those things enable us to, that's what we rely on to make sure that we can be consistent everywhere we're operating, even though it's true that we will get pressure from governments, but we have to kind of have that to fall back on.
Thank you, Alex. Mivan?
I think that was a great summary. And the only thing I would add on terms is I've seen, like Alex, I've seen like a lot of work done on the different terms in this space. And I think that sometimes different terms are helpful for different types of things. But I think the way that I like to think about it personally that makes it very real and reminds me and others of the importance of this work is thinking about it through the lens of harms. And I think that there is some really excellent work being done at the moment by a professor called Peter Cunliffe-Jones at Westminster University to develop a harms framework specifically for mis and disinformation. And the European Fact-Checking Standards Network is a couple of organizations in Europe are looking to actually start using that in a meaningful way, to actually highlight the harms of misinformation in like a completely different way. Because I think it's one thing to say there's misinformation, and it's another thing to say there has been 5% election interference in this country, right? Or vaccine misinformation that has led to this harm. And I think that is the level of granularity we need to get to. And at that point, we kind of bypass some of the issues of the words and we get more to those claims and those narratives and those harms. And it's only at that kind of detail we can start to understand what interventions are meaningful and who should take them. Should that intervention come from a government? Should that intervention come from a platform? Should that intervention come from the community or the people affected? Because I think actually we need interventions at all of those levels. Thanks.
Alex, did you have anything to that? Nope. Okay. I've just been shown the we have 5 minutes to wrap up sign from our helpful tech support in the room. So what I'm going to do is ask each of our panelists, I guess, if you had one piece of advice that you could offer people who might be interested in either participating in or starting their own elections coalition, what would that piece of advice be? And then a call to action coming out of today, what would you like to see happen? We'll start with David, please.
I would say the first thing, if you're obviously an election or election fields, doing something around election coalition, have a common interest. You know, there's no point doing it if you're not seeing things from the same perspective. I also get to keep you out there, you know, but also I experience in Africa is that Google does not have oversight on any election campaign you have in Africa. You know, like Google said, there's some support and spending. I can tell you that ultra that funding is free. The talk last thing you have to do is, you know, understanding that there will be problems that will be challenging. And what we that helps us in Africa is that we're able to develop efforts very early in the day. And many times the coalitions are sort of either coordinated or sort of, you know, coordinated by IFC members where there is a transparency of funding, transparency of correction policy, the things in church. Also, the pandemic actually take everything. So we have a sort of methodology of, you know, what we even think about teachers in the world. Is that we want to actually like debunk the very fancy thing around the elections. You know, I think that's where it should be coming from, and that's really the thing that's my yes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, David. Daniel, turn to you.
Yes. Sorry, my camera was off. My advice is choose wisely the organization that is going to coordinate your coalition. As Mivan said, it has to be some organization that is, if not neutral, the more neutral possible, equidistant in terms of political stance, independent from parties and from government and from private sector pressures. I know that sometimes it's difficult to find an organization with that characteristics, but it is essential to gain trust and to lead the work.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Mivan.
I'd say the relationships are everything in election coalitions. So similar kind of to Daniel's points, but it's really important to not underestimate the amount of work it will take to actually build those relationships across those media organizations and across those people. I think that when you get a group of people like that coming together who trust each other, that's when something special can happen, but that takes time. And I'd also add, because relationships take time to build, maybe it's not the first election that's the best one. Maybe it's the second one or the third one. And I think that Comprova is a very good example of that. And I think that as those relationships build, so does the opportunity and the scale of those coalitions. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. And then finally here in the room, Alex? No? Okay. So I want to thank everybody. It was a great presentation, some very good questions, some very pointed questions, frankly, and a good discussion. For those in the room who want a copy of the slides, just come see me. I've already sent them to somebody online who wanted them. And I do want to thank our panelists who all got up at varying degrees of the middle of the night to join us, and for Alex for joining us here in person. Thanks for everybody for showing up in person and online. More to come. And then for those in the room Mivan's been dropping links to various information into the chat. So when the recording is posted on the IGF website, be sure to go back, and that information is for you waiting. So thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much.